Discord and somehow join again for some reason. Maybe we're doing something wrong, I don't know. Technically, I can check again, but you should be able to unmute yourself. Yeah, it looks like you should be able to. I hope. Oh yeah, it looks good.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I
Hey,
can
man.
hear you. Lovely.
Yay. Okay, good.
Wonderful.
You find. Where am I? I'm in the wrong place. Okay. Okay, nice.
That's perfect. Hello and welcome, Lynn.
Hi. Good to meet.
Yeah. Like we're like in this space where people are all over the place. Some are still eating some lunch because we have like talk after talk, so you have to squeeze it in between the talks. Yeah, we got more people confirming their talk than we initially imagined. But all right, then we just have a lot of talks.
And we're excited.
Yeah, I was checking out the list. A lot of speakers.
Yeah.
So when you're ready, we are ready. Everything seems to work properly.
Sweet.
Oh, perfect. Cool. So let's jump into it. So hello, everyone. My name's Shane. I'm a software developer and mushroom grower from Canada. I've been working in the holochain sphere for about a year now and building a Valueflows modeler. So maybe about a month ago, Sarah Path jumped into the Discord channel and asked if someone would be willing to give a complete and pragmatic overview of Valueflows in 30 minutes. So this is how we are going to go about that. I'm going to assume no knowledge, no prior knowledge of Valueflows. So we'll start at square one, and I'll go through a little bit of the vocabulary and some of the common terms that we use to describe Valueflows. And then building on top of that, we'll look at some patterns that emerge from that vocabulary. With those simple patterns, we are going to then attempt to model the Wizard Amigos GitHub project management and tracking system that we have here. So specifically the tiling window manager, UI/UX project. And then we'll tie it up at the end with that model and see how it can then be translated into software. So we're not going to be writing any code, but we'll talk about what the design might look like going from a Valueflows model to writing an application. So Valueflows is a vocabulary to coordinate the creation, distribution, and exchange of economic resources. And it works with any kind of resources, works with any kind of economic activity. But the focus of it is for groups and people experimenting with solidarity, cooperative models, collaborative models, small businesses, commons-based peer production, and any transactional economies. So in other words, like let's help a lot of the alternative economic software projects that are solving different pieces of the same puzzle be able to interoperate. So Valueflows is based on REA accounting, and that stands for resources, events, and agents. I'm seeing sound levels a little low on YouTube. Should I speak a little bit louder, or is that an internal thing? Better now. I'll keep going. So REA stands for resources, events, and agents, and these are really the backbone of Valueflows. Valueflows adds a lot more onto that, but let's start with that. So an agent is any one person or any group that does economic activities and helps move around economic resource. An event, an economic event, any action that changes, creates, consumes, uses, or destroys resources, or transfers them from an agent to another, or transports them from one place to another. And finally, economic resources could be goods, services, money, energy, labor, skills, CO2, methane, heat, air, water, even soil microbiota, and in this case, Figma design documents. So Valueflows, there's three different layers to it, and there's a bunch of different pieces. And one of the cool things about it is you can kind of pick and choose the pieces that you want, and also the layers that you want to be interacting on or at. So the top layer is a knowledge layer, and this is really for like talking about specifications and recipes and processes, like kind of basically just like how we do things, right? How do you do things? And that's on that level there. The plan is like, okay, let's coordinate. Let's actually figure out how we want to do something. And then the observation layer is, okay, we did something and now we're going to record it. This is the kind of the simplest flow that we're going to see in Valueflows. So it starts and ends with economic resources. You do something to it and it's an input to a process, and then something happens to it as an output, and then you have another economic resource on the outside. An agent is the person or the group that does the action. These can be chained together, or not chained together, but they can be in parallel, so a bunch of inputs and a bunch of outputs. A classic example in Valueflows is baking a pie. So economic resources on the input might be flour, apples, sugar, eggs. A process might be baking the pie, and some outputs might be, a baked pie and some organic waste that's going to go into the compost bin, for example. Yeah.
Just one question. Okay, the example makes sense, but the diagram says the economic resources, which would be the eggs, the flour, the apples, and then there's the process of baking, but there's this action in between. How's that different from the process?
Yeah.
What's meant by that?
Yeah, so the action, let's see, the process, yeah, so I got confused on that when I first started looking at this as well. A process is really just a thing that links inputs and outputs, right? So the stuff doing is happening in the actions. Those are the events, right? So consuming, chopping up an apple, or consuming an apple, or I'm fumbling a bit for words here. Lynn, would you mind jumping in on explaining how processes and the events fit in here in this case?
Sure. Actually, I'm gonna take it a slightly different direction than you did, Shane. So processes is what is making the transformation between the inputs and the outputs. The events or the flows with their action are more like, in some ways you could just look at it as the accounting of what happens to these resources. Like if there's flour, the action might be consume, and then there's going to be less flour, If the action is produce on the output and we're producing some pies, then there's going to be more pies, or some pies. So it basically says what's going to happen to your resource. And sometimes nothing happens to the resource. Maybe you're just citing something that you used that was really helpful, that's an electronic document, and it sits right where it is. Help?
Yeah, okay, I think that helps. So I imagine, for example, if I have flour, apples as input, then the action would be to reduce the amounts of flour and apples that I have, because those are now entering the process, and then the process might take some time, and then on the other side I get the action plus one pie or whatever, something like that.
Yeah,
Yep.
definitely. Yep. And so I think this is actually a pretty good time to look at what the actual actions are in Valueflows, to see like what kind of stuff we can do. So in the example with the pie, a lot of it is going to be consume. Do I even have consume on here? I don't. Well, let's add it. Consume. Right. So you're consuming apples, you're consuming flour, but you might use a rolling pin. You might use an oven, right? The rolling pin hopefully doesn't get incorporated into the pie. So stuff that doesn't get used up. You can also cite something. So if you're looking at a document, or if you're doing research, you might cite a document. You can move something, right? If you're just moving it from one place to another, pickup and delivery. Combine and separate could be good for, let's say I bake a bunch of pies, but then I combine them into a large box that has 4 pies, and now I want to refer to that box of pies as another resource. And then likewise, if I unpack the pies at a different location and sell them, or trade them at kind of in a retail space, that might be a separate. I have an asterisk next to work. And the reason I have that is because work is both an action and work is also a resource, right? Because human labor is something that can be quantified, it can be tracked, and usually it's quite desirable to track that. So work is a resource and work is an action. And in that case, you will typically pair, not typically, you kind of have to pair any work resource with a work action. All right. So, okay, where to go from here? Okay, cool. So let's take a look at this example right here. So this is our first Figma refinement example, right? So in this case here, we're taking an economic resource, and it's a Figma file, it's version 3, and we can cite that. It goes into a design process, and it produces, oops, that should be version 4, right? And this will likely be the same person, right? It'll be likely be one person that is citing it, the same person is then doing the work and producing that. So there's a cite and a produce, and you'll notice this, the more you work with Valueflows, you'll see that there's going to be these like kind of pairings on one side that match, or stuff on the input that will match the output. So for example, like like consume and produce tend to go together, right? You consume some stuff and then you produce something else. A pickup and delivery might go together quite well. Accept and modify go together. And some of them don't have counterparts, but some of them do. So you might have noticed I have 3 different green arrows all pointing to cite: intent, commitment, and economic event. And so these things are interchangeable in this resource flow, but they talk about different points in time. So an intent is something that could happen in the future, something that would happen in the future if some condition was met. Oh, main crew just dropped off. Should I pause? Let me know when I can keep going. Good. Cool. So like I was saying, so an intent is something that could happen in the future, that would happen if some condition is met. A commitment is, I will do that, right? I'm committing to doing this thing. And an economic event is, I did a thing, right? I'm kind of recording the work that I did, or I'm recording some work that has happened. And so you can have a flow, a resource flow that looks like this, with an intent, another one with a commitment, and another one with an economic event. And that is kind of what happens here. So when someone generates a new GitHub project, they're basically saying, hey, I have work that I want done. Would someone do this? Right? So that's analogous to an intent, or rather each of these to-dos are analogous to an intent. So design a draft, refinement number 1, refinement number 2, because no one has signed up for it. There's no human, there's no agent that's been associated with that yet. So someone says, hey, I need some work done. I need some design system components. It should take about 4 hours. Then someone says, okay, I'll commit to that, right? I'm going to do that. And I think it'll take 4 hours. So there's your commitment. Then after the work's done, these work logs are created, and those are analogous to economic events saying, hey, I did the work, right? This is proof that I did the work. Here's a video, here's the documents, whatever. And it could be the person that committed, or it could be also someone else that hasn't committed to that work, right? There doesn't have to be a one-to-one mapping from events to commitments. The words that we use to kind of link them, right? Because you might want to trace through time who put out the intent, who's committing to it, who actually did it. Do we still need someone to do the work and whatnot? So we say that commitments satisfy intents, and we say that events fulfill commitments. Any questions so far? Or is that pretty clear? Thumbs up, right on. Cool. And it doesn't always have to be this way, right? It's a pretty plug and play kind of system. So if you only really want to be working with intents, you can. If you only want to be working with events, you can. Right. So for an example would be like a time tracker task logging application. You're only really logging events, right? You stop the timer, you're logging an economic event. If you want to do some kind of, more coordination, you might have a to-do list, right? Bunch of commitments, and then people will log their time against that. So you can kind of plug and play with whatever combination of these things that makes sense for what you're trying to do. That is a text version of what I just described, so we can move on from that. Okay, here's a unique version of a resource flow. It's called a transfer. To a thing, right? They don't all have to happen, but they could happen all at the same time. So for example, if I'm selling you an apple, I'm going to transfer, I'm going to do a full transfer of an apple from me to you, right? I'm giving you the physical apple, and I'm giving you it's kind of the rights to the apple. You can do what you want with it. You can eat it or make a pie with it. With a house, it doesn't totally make sense to be transferring or moving the kind of the location of the house. So in that case, it's just I'm giving the rights. I'm giving the rights to a house. And then for the transfer of the custody, think about a library, right? So you got to give the book back. That's the agreement when you go to a library. You can have the book for a little while, but you got to give it back. So in maybe a tool library or some kind of resource sharing application, a lot of the time the main thing would be a transferring of the custody. So anyways, that was a bit of a tangent, but the point I want to get at is there's not really a process here. There's no kind of input action and output action. It's just one event or commitment or intent that goes between two different agents, and it's the resource that flows through there. Okay. All right, so from zoomed out, these two resource flows look pretty identical, but depending on what you're trying to do, the outcome will be different. So here's the first one here. We're going back to the Figma design process. So we start with a resource called version 2, and we're going to cite it. Then it goes into a process where we're designing it, Refinement 3, and we produce version 3. We go through the process again where we cite it, we do a refinement, and we produce version 4, and again, process 5, and then version 5. So that's a cite and a produce pairing, right? So each time, essentially, we're creating a new document. Also, which is totally valid. You can totally do that. And when I poked around the Figma file, or when we poked around the Figma file, this is more what it looks like. It looks like you're accepting the current Figma file and you're modifying it some, right? You're just kind of appending the new version to the Figma file. And so this goes back to the action pairing I was mentioning earlier. So accept and modify are the pairing here. In this case, yeah, you're not mentioning the version on the Figma file or on the economic resource here. You could if you want to, but essentially it's the same file that's just changing over time. So again, Valueflows is pretty, you can choose what you want with it to match your context. So if the first one makes more sense to you, go ahead and use that. And if the second one makes more sense to you, you can definitely use that as well. Okay. Something that I was curious about that we didn't know is when a project owner comes and proposes or puts a new project in GitHub, there is the implication that the work is going to be compensated in some way or another. Would you be able to share quickly how that exchange works? Because it's not tracked in GitHub.
Yeah, I can. So usually when we work with people, we do some sort of contract where we define how many hours people have time or feel like working. Like usually it's like anything between 0 and 20 hours. Sometimes it's also more per week. Yes. And then we also set a rate, and then basically what happens, and I'm not sure if it's on those examples on GitHub, but usually when there's a work log comment, so there should be the 3 to 5 minute video, multiple, and then there's all the to-dos that have been done, but usually behind each to-do there should be a time logged. This happens in parallel also on some private document where people basically prepare their invoice, so it's basically happens in two places. Ideally in the future we would only log it in the work log comments, and then we had some automation that kind of summarizes it or exports it and generates some sort of invoice or something from that. Does that answer the question?
Perfectly, thank you. Cool. So then we can, with that information, we can model the exchange, right? So it's right so far up to this point, we've only talked about Figma files, right? We're making Figma files, we're modifying design documents, but there's kind of a two-way flow of value here, of resources, right? There's the actual document, and then there's the compensation in whatever capacity. So something that if you decided to make your own software to replace GitHub and the internal documents, in Valueflows speak, the project creator, or the project owner here would, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just maybe I forgot. So because we don't have that in this particular example that I shared with you, but we have another project example where each to-do or each group of to-do has actually a set budget. So when people commit, they know already what the budget is, and they committed to it, and then they do all the things, and how long it takes them, it's up to them. So it depends on the situation. We usually work with both, and so these are both examples, and the only difference is either there's a budget set or people just log their time and then get paid based on the rate that we agreed on.
Cool. All right, that works. I guess kind of behind the scenes in Valueflow speak, both those scenarios are actually identical. Because what happens is the project owner, whoever's setting up the to-dos or the budgets, whether it's an individual or a group, is basically creating two intents, right? One of the intent is, hey, I need some design work done. And the other intent is, all right, whatever dollars per hour or dollars per project, for example. So those are two intents. And then, right, people come and they will commit to it. So we've seen this before. Commitments satisfy intents. So one side of it is I'm committing to doing the design work, and the other side is, well, I'm committing to paying you. Right? And that's the two-way flow. And those are bound in an agreement. And that's the thing that kind of ties those two resource flows together, one going in each direction. And then they do the work, however many hours or however many to-dos, and they compensated such a way. So if you're designing your back-end system, this could be a way to model it. Right. So I think that was mostly it here. I'm going to go over to, so kind of moving on to, should I move on to that? Lynn, do you have anything else that you want to add? I was thinking about going over to the UML diagram briefly and just kind of orienting on there.
I don't have anything to add, and I don't know if the UML diagram is too scary or not, but I could give a quick walkthrough if people want, but it's a UML diagram.
Yeah,
It's very static, which is one thing, but no, whatever y'all want is cool.
definitely. Okay, cool. Well,
Question
I'll
on the
start
last
just by going to the Valueflows website. So you can check this website out, valueflow.ws, and there's a lot of stuff here. Yeah, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, so I just had a question on the last bit, because there were some of the flows with the horizontal ones, which were the economic resource with an action and a process and maybe another action and resource. And then the intent and fulfillment and stuff like that seemed to go vertically down, and I couldn't quite get the relationship between all those terms. And
Got it.
Were
Okay.
the fulfillment and all of that stuff, were they actions? Or yeah, I won't guess. Maybe you can just share.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. That's a fantastic question. So I'm going to do a quick live modification here. So this, right? We could essentially replace this. I'm going to just shrink this down right here and put that in like that, right? So this is a valid resource flow that describes something that could happen. And depending on the software that you're building, you might want to be tracking things that could happen, or things basically in the realm of needs and offers matching, right? I want this thing to happen. I need this thing. So this is a totally valid resource flow. You can do the exact same thing again, right? You can describe another resource flow at a different point in time or at a different state, right? In such a way. So it kind of is to come back to your original question of, okay, there's some stuff going left to right and there's some stuff that's vertical. The stuff that's vertical is at different points in time. And so rather than, basically, I was a bit lazy, right? So rather than drawing out the whole thing 3 times, I wanted to say that, hey, the kind of the backbone of this resource flow is going to be identical, right? It's going to be resource, some kind of action, process, action, resource. Right, and you can do the exact same thing with an event. And so again, it depends on what you want to actually do, what kind of stuff that you want to see, what do you want to track, what do you want to account for. But the point of the verticalness was just to kind of show that they're A, interchangeable, and B, how they link to each other, right? So if you need to kind of do some tracking or tracing, that is possible through fulfillments and satisfactions. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
Mostly, but there's still one bit, like on the right, the vertical one on the right, which had the fulfillment bits and the money stuff.
Oh yeah, sure.
On like the lines there seem different to the process. Like the lines on the left are like the value flows with the resources, and the lines here are expressing a different type of relationship between these boxes, I think.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, totally. So, yeah, so I'm definitely hiding some information here. So basically, wherever you see an intent right here, you can kind of imagine an entire resource flow kind of coming in and out of that, right? So if I wanted to like, might get a little messy here, but we'll try it out here. So you can kind of imagine like that, right? That's kind of what I was implying in this diagram. If you see an intent, you're kind of implying an entire resource flow, whether kind of in the future or committed to, or as in the past that has already been done. And you can do the same thing with commitment, same thing with economic event. But the point of these lines is really to show an exchange, right? How do you link 2 resource flows that are related such that one is compensating for the other, or that should happen in tandem, right? So yes, these lines here, actually, to be fair, these lines right here, right, between intent, satisfaction, and commitment are identical to these ones right here. They're just linking intents, commitments, and events through time. The only thing that's different here is there's this agreement, right? And these lines are linking the agreement, and so therefore links the events and the intents as well. That makes sense? Sweet. Cool. All right. Oh, right. This was a super important. I didn't mention that at all. Okay. So Valueflows also has this notion of a plan. And so a plan is a container for one or more resource flows. So essentially, when one person creates a new GitHub issue, this thing is acting like a resource flows plan, right? And everything inside are the flows, your intents, your commitments, your events, however they show up. So we can say that, hey, this tiling window manager, this is a plan, and we're going to be throwing a whole bunch of stuff in there, right? And there's going to be some inputs to that plan. I think in this case, the input was a short summary about it. And then the output for this whole thing is going to be, hopefully, I don't know if it's a design kit or an actual piece of software, a tiling window manager. But in any case, it's like, okay, all of that's wrapped in a plan. Sometimes during the course of a project, more work will show up. And from what I understand, all these design things, these tab container permissions pop over, those are kind of like almost like sub projects. So they are their own separate GitHub issues. So we'll just go over to history logs, pop over here. So right, same thing here. We have a top level plan, and then we have our to-dos, right? There's an intent to do some work, an intent to get paid for it maybe, people committing to do it, and then there's actual events logged that the work has been done. Plans can flow into each other, right? So correct me if I'm wrong, but these kind of sub-projects right here, all these design sub-projects are actually kind of requirements for this main plan to be done, right? So they kind of have to flow into that. Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, kind of. The subtasks are technically more like a grouping of tasks and a little bit arbitrary. The real dependencies are usually expressed when there is a, let's say that it could be a subtask, it could be technically any task that has an output document, but then those output documents are inputs into later tasks. And when there is an input document that comes from another task, that's like the real dependency. And the way they're grouped is more like for convenient, and they're often kind of similar, but they don't have to be. So there could be input documents that come from a completely different branch of the project that are linked. So if that makes sense. So it's always input in one or more inputs into a task, and then one or more outputs of a task. Or it could also be no inputs in the task and or no output. But the outputs will then be reused in later tasks until at some point they translate into the final output of the project. And this subgrouping of to-dos is more a bit for convenience, for how people maybe think like, okay, I have this is my whole project, and they divide it into multiple phases or something that I can deal with it in my head.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I think it's something that we came up against when we're designing the Valueflows play space, is that the data structure is not the user interface, right? And we ran into that a couple of times, right? And so whatever makes sense for the user, that's probably what should be implemented, right? But in Valueflow speak, you can't really nest processes. That's not how the vocabulary works. So a way that Lynn and I thought about it is subtasks are basically just separate plans that then feed into the main plan that is the GitHub issue. And the thing with that is each of these plans, subplans, if you will, are outputting some design document, some component that can be used in anywhere else, right? It is a requirement for this. It is a dependency of or it is a dependency of that. No other way. Yeah, that was the right words. But it can also be used in other projects if need be, or if other files. Like, hey, I'm actually going to reuse this component file, for example. So basically, this is a way to kind of unpack the nested to-do list in Valueflows speak, right? And the purple boxes here are just the plans. So we mentioned at the start that Valueflows is designed for collaboration across distributed communities, organizations, and also fractally as well. So I'm making an assumption here that this tiling window manager, whatever work is done, this can be a single flow, or it can be, a whole bunch of flows, depending on how many design iterations, how many things get produced, right? You can have as many flows as you want inside a plan. But at some point, that's going to go somewhere and it's going to do something. And I don't know who the client is or what it's for, but let's just say we have some fictitious client. And you can transfer from one agent to another, right? Because an agent can be a group, it could be an organization. It could also be groups of groups, right? So I'm not sure who's going to use it, but you can transfer across the domain of organizations, and you can even transfer across the domain of different networks, right? So let's say that the Wizard Amigos and their clients are kind of operating within one network. And let's say in a world, these design components go into some piece of software, and that piece of software is used to make some physical thing in the world that then goes, anywhere in the world. It could go down the road, or it can go thousands of kilometers away, right? And so you can be nesting these groups inside other groups, and you could be transferring through them, and kind of up and down. So basically, wherever resources are needed, right, and however you want to link up these networks, it's quite easy to do that. And there's no chain. You don't need anything more than what we've talked about so far to describe internal stuff or cross-boundary stuff or kind of nested organizational stuff. It's all can be done with this event called a transfer. Okay. I'm going to switch off this diagram unless there are some questions before I do that. We're good? All right. Cool. So this valueflow.ws is a fantastic resource. It goes into much more detail and depth than I just did right here. And there's a lot more information here about resources, flows, actions. You can get better descriptions of everything. Like, how do you model exchanges? We didn't even talk about, like recipes and stuff. But what does operational planning look like? There's a whole bunch of stuff here. And one resource that I go to a lot is under the specifications, and I just look at this Uml diagram. And there's a lot of lines going on here, but there's some stuff that we've seen already. There's 3 layers: a knowledge layer, planning layer, an observation layer. There's intents, commitments, economic events, satisfactions, fulfillments, processes. We've seen all of that so far. And so when you're actually getting down to code something with Valueflows, this is just a super helpful resource to figure out, okay, how are they related, or what kind of properties do each of these entities have. Some also good things. There's the where was it? I think we mostly got through it, but yeah, the classic Valueflows story right here it follows a full pie baking example from harvesting the apples up to distributing the apples around, or the apple pies around the community. So it includes stuff like deliveries and whatnot, which might be interesting for those who are curious. That is pretty much what I had to show you guys today. So open discussion or questions, if you will.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. I have a question. Are value flows like these diagrams meant to be produced manually, or are there tools that like, like, I don't know what kind of things would that be, but that you kind of like just document your own work, and then other projects or companies or organizations also do so, and then these diagrams get generated automatically from our activity and logging our stuff?
Yeah, yeah, super good question. So we're working on that right now. That's what the RA PlaySpace is. So myself and a coworker Jill and Lynn and her partner Bob we're working on this. So it's basically a Valueflows modeler. So the idea is it basically helps people understand the Valueflows vocabulary and also start modeling processes. And as we've been building this, we're realizing that the data doesn't actually have to come from, like dragging and dropping these things, because that's what it is. It's a drag and drop editor, and you connect the edges and stuff. But it could be used as a visualizer as well. So if kind of a dream right now is like, okay, can you plunk the REA PlaySpace on top of an existing data structure that conforms to Valueflows, and can it generate all of that stuff for you, with some sensible defaults? So that's kind of what we're working on right now. Lynn, maybe you want to jump in, because I don't know of any other software that can like generate Valueflows based on like text or data.
So Valueflows, I mean, you don't have to think about it any differently than just applications. So whatever your, like any user interface you can think of that does economic things can be designed with Valueflows in mind, either as like the whole model if you wanted to do that from scratch, or if you have an application, you could also write an API that would generate Valueflows vocabulary, an agreed protocol, and talk to other applications. So it's, so it's got a model, right, a data model, and then a interaction definitions. Its core is RDF, like the semantic web stuff, but our intention is that it works for whatever anybody wants to do. This stuff changes fast. And there are many opinions, and we want to support whatever people want to do with their applications, but it's not different than kind of if you think about creating whatever application you want, in whatever language you want, or I don't know if that helped,
Yeah, so I have a question about like if I thought of a particular economic exchange that I wanted to model with this, is there like a right way to model it, like a definitive right way if I went into all the details and that's what I should be aiming? Or would there be multiple ways of modeling it that are all equally sort of valid? As I was looking, it seemed that you could, I don't know, model things in slightly different ways. And so it's how do you resolve the ambiguity of which approach to take if there's not one correct one? Yeah.
Yeah. There are correct ones and not correct ones, but there are definitely choices, and some of it has like pretty concrete reasons to do it a certain way, like this example that Shane is showing right here. If you use cite and produce, you do that because you want to save each refinement as its own resource somewhere. If you use accept and modify, you're going to end up with, it's one resource that's traveling through multiple processes, and what you're going to end up with at the end is the Figma file as your resource. So there are more correct ways to do things and less correct, but there are also just a lot of dependencies on where you're trying to go with it, and some of it is a little bit of an art, or a little bit of, like, for example, the size of processes. Processes can be pretty granular or not, So So there's a little bit of a art and trial and error on some of it.
Something I'll add on to that is something that's helped me because I've come up with that question and some of that confusion is like diving into the actions and just be like, okay, what do each of these actions, like what are they really meant for? And in doing so, spending a bit of time with this page here can help clarify or at least kind of remove a lot of the wrong choices and then give you a lot more clarity on what the available choices actually are. So that's, well, yeah. So you're thinking about actions to help with that.
And so I could do endless questions, I think, but I have another one. Say there's two different software platforms that are implementing Valueflows, which could be the Hollow IREA and Bonfire, for example. What does it look like for them to communicate with each other? Like how does that flow work and the data? Or is it more that one Valueflows model could represent different sort of different things, but it would all be inside one system? Like, is it an inter-application protocol across the platforms? And how does that look right now and in the future? Yeah.
Right now, that looks pretty separate. People tend to be working, so Holochain and Bonfire, your examples, are using, our whole HREA and Bonfire are using the same vocabulary, Valueflows, but they're using different technical protocols. So right now they can't talk to each other, right? The hope is that at some point that stuff can get merged and fixed. So like, for example, Holochain could implement the protocol that's used in what's called the Fediverse, which is these federated applications that can talk to each other using ActivityPub and starting to also use Valueflows to do economic stuff. So Holochain would need to translate, sort of put another layer of API on so that it could federate into the Fediverse, for example. Yeah, because right now there are definitely different ways to do it. You know, a bunch of people are using GraphQL so that front ends can talk to back ends. So like in that case, you could take a front end that uses the Valueflows with that exact protocol and plop it from HREA onto Bonfire, because those are both implementing a GraphQL Valueflows protocol. Or like there's people working on straight up RDF semantic web implementations, you know, so they're going to output something that other semantic web based applications would recognize. So the only thing to do now is to either decide the same technical protocol, or write kind of an additional translation layer or something to get it across. So all this is, you know, there's a bunch of future dreams involved here, right? If you want to do really, really big economic networks. So the vocabulary is a piece of it, but it's not everything.
All right. Then thank you very much. That was really great to see not only an overview, but also having the chance of answering some questions and even getting it explained on the specific example of how we do the to-dos in Wizard Amigos. Yeah, is there like any links that you want to share maybe in the chat where people can reach out for further questions? I mean, Valueflows, like the website we know, but
Sure.
maybe you want to share some more.
Yeah, sure. A few things. Yeah. So, come on, hang out in the HREA Discord server. There's generally quite a few people that are happy just to like talk Valueflows and help with model stuff. There's the Valueflows website, so valueflow.ws. I'll just drop that in the live stream chat right here. There we go. So that's also good too. Also, I'm going to plug the REA PlaySpace. So right now we're actively looking for users. We're looking for bug reports. So if you are inclined to try it out, give it a shot, see what you like, see what you don't like, or if you totally bounce off, we want to know as well. It's all valuable to us. So I'll drop that link right there. And then there's, let's see, what else would be good to share?
There are
And
a
do you have
couple
anything?
links to welcome channels on the front page of the website. If you just want to come and ask a Valueflows question randomly, you can do that. There's a Gitter chat, which is our original one, and there's a Matrix chat, which and they sync with each other.
And I'm going to just throw in, let's see, where the chat go.
Great.
Throw that in right there. Cool.
Then thank you very much for sharing all of that with us, and then we will follow up on Discord or Matrix or Gitter chat, and maybe who knows, maybe we can do like a follow-up talk next year when we do it again. Yeah. Otherwise, but thank you very much for sharing it.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for inviting us to talk. Enjoy the rest of your code camp.
See you.
Great to meet
next
you
time.
guys in a little bit more person. Yep.
Yeah.